"Fat monkey. How dare you sit on that bench and pretend you're one of us?" The words sliced through the air like a jagged knife, each syllable dripping with venom. The voice belonged to Officer Carl, a tall, broad-shouldered man with cold blue eyes and a sneer that could curdle milk. He stood in the middle of the courtroom, his uniform crisp, his posture rigid, but his words were anything but professional. The room, usually a place of order and decorum, was now a stage for humiliation. Judge Deborah Williams, a 45-year-old black woman with a commanding presence, sat frozen on her bench. Her dark skin glistened under the harsh fluorescent lights, her usually confident eyes now wide with shock. Her full figure, always a source of pride for her, now felt like a target painted on her back. The courtroom, with its high ceilings and polished wooden benches, felt like a cage. The air was thick with tension, the kind that made it hard to breathe, like the moment before a storm breaks. Deborah's hands trembled as she gripped the edge of her bench. She could feel the eyes of everyone in the room, bailiffs, lawyers, spectators, burning into her skin. The officer's words weren't just an insult. They were a weapon designed to strip her of her dignity, to reduce her to nothing. And for a moment it worked. Deborah felt small, smaller than she had ever felt in her life. The weight of centuries of oppression seemed to press down on her shoulders, a burden she hadn't asked for but carried nonetheless. The courtroom was a sterile, suffocating space. The walls were a dull beige, the kind of color that seemed to absorb hope rather than reflect it. The wooden benches creaked under the weight of the spectators, their whispers like the rustling of dead leaves. Deborah could smell the faint tang of sweat and anxiety, mingling with the sterile scent of cleaning products. Her own heartbeat thundered in her ears, a relentless drumbeat that drowned out almost everything else. Officer Carl leaned forward, his lips curled into a sneer. "You think you can come into our country and judge us? You think you belong here? You're nothing but a fat, worthless monkey." His voice rose with each word, spittle flying from his lips. Deborah felt her stomach churn, a mix of anger and humiliation boiling inside her. She wanted to scream, to lash out, but she knew better. She had been here before in one way or another. This wasn't just about her. This was about every black woman who had ever stood in a position of power and been judged not by her actions but by the color of her skin and the shape of her body. The other officers in the room shifted uncomfortably, their hands resting on their belts, ready for anything. The prosecutor, a smug-looking man in a tailored suit, barely hid his smirk. Deborah's chest tightened. "Creature." The word echoed in her mind, a cruel reminder of how little she meant to people like him. Officer Carl leaned back, his eyes narrowing as he delivered his final blow. "I've seen your kind before. You're nothing but a blight on society. And I won't have you wasting any more of this court's time. You're dismissed." The gavel came down with a sharp crack, and just like that, Deborah's fate was sealed. The room erupted into murmurs, but Deborah barely heard them. Her mind was a whirlwind of emotions, anger, shame, despair. She felt like she was drowning, the weight of the officer's words pulling her under. But as the officers approached to escort her out, something inside Deborah shifted. It was a small spark, barely noticeable at first, but it was there. A flicker of defiance, of determination. She had been knocked down before, but she had always gotten back up. And this time would be no different. Little did anyone know, including Deborah, that this moment would be the catalyst for something far greater. The storm in the courtroom was just the beginning. And Officer Carl, for all his power and arrogance, had no idea what was coming. As Deborah was led out of the courtroom, the weight of her past pressed down on her like a lead blanket. The fluorescent lights of the hallway flickered above, casting eerie shadows on the cold, tiled floor. The officers flanked her, their grips firm and unyielding, as if they expected her to bolt at any moment. Deborah kept her head down, her eyes fixed on the ground, but her mind was racing. She thought about her childhood in the south side of Chicago, a place where hope was as scarce as clean water. She remembered the sound of gunshots echoing through the night, the sight of her mother crying as she counted the few dollars she had left to feed her and her siblings. She remembered the day her father was arrested for a crime he didn't commit, the way her mother's face had crumpled when the police came knocking. That was the day Deborah had vowed to be different, to rise above the circumstances that seemed determined to drag her down. But life had other plans. At 17, Deborah was arrested for the first time, caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. She had been walking home from school when a fight broke out between two rival gangs. The police arrived, and Deborah, along with several other black teens, was rounded up and charged with disorderly conduct. It didn't matter that she hadn't thrown a single punch. The color of her skin was enough to make her guilty in their eyes. That arrest was the first of many. Over the years, Deborah found herself caught in a vicious cycle. Arrested, released, and arrested again. Each time the charges were minor: loitering, trespassing, possession of a small amount of marijuana, but they added up. And each time she was treated like a criminal, like someone who didn't deserve a second chance. Now, as she sat in the cold, sterile holding cell, waiting to be processed, Deborah felt the weight of those years pressing down on her. The officer's words echoed in her mind, a cruel reminder of how little she meant to people like him. But beneath the anger and the shame there was something else, a quiet determination, a refusal to let them win. Deborah leaned her head back against the concrete wall, closing her eyes. She thought about her daughter, Maya, who was waiting for her at home. She was only 6 years old, but she was already so smart, so full of life. She was the reason Deborah kept fighting, the reason she refused to give up. She couldn't let her grow up in a world where she was judged by the color of her skin, where she was treated like less than human. As the hours passed, Deborah's resolve hardened. She didn't know how, but she was going to fight back. She was going to prove that she was more than the sum of her mistakes, more than the stereotypes that people like Officer Carl used to define her. And she was going to make sure that no one else had to go through what she had. The days turned into weeks, and Deborah found herself trapped in a legal nightmare. The charges against her were baseless, but the system was rigged, and it seemed like no one was willing to stand up for her. Deborah sat in her cell, her mind racing with thoughts of Maya and the life she was missing out on. The other inmates tried to engage her in conversation, but Deborah kept to herself, her thoughts consumed by the injustice of her situation. One day, as she was sitting in the prison library, Deborah came across a book on civil rights law. She flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning the words, and something inside her clicked. She realized that she didn't have to accept the way things were. She could fight back, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly by the system. With a newfound sense of purpose, Deborah began to study. She read everything she could get her hands on: books on law, on civil rights, on the history of racial injustice in America. She wrote letters to organizations that fought for criminal justice reform, explaining her situation and asking for help. And slowly but surely she began to see a way out. Meanwhile, outside the prison walls, Emily, Deborah's clerk, was working tirelessly on her case. She had been horrified by Officer Carl's behavior in the courtroom and was determined to see justice done. She filed motion after motion, challenging the charges and arguing that Deborah's rights had been violated. But Officer Carl was a powerful figure, and it seemed like no one was willing to stand up to him. That is, until one day, when Emily received a call from a reporter at a major news outlet. The reporter had heard about Deborah's case and wanted to do a story on it. Emily hesitated at first, knowing that going public could be risky, but she also knew that it might be their only chance to get Deborah the help she needed. The story was published a week later, and it quickly went viral. People across the country were outraged by Officer Carl's blatant racism and the injustice of Deborah's situation. Protests erupted outside the courthouse, demanding that Deborah be released and that Officer Carl be held accountable for his actions. Inside the prison, Deborah watched the news with a mixture of hope and disbelief. She had never imagined that her story would resonate with so many people, that they would rally to her cause. But as the days passed and the pressure mounted, she began to believe that maybe, just maybe, justice would prevail. The day of Deborah's hearing arrived, and the courtroom was packed with spectators, reporters, and activists. The air was thick with anticipation, the kind of tension that made it hard to breathe. Deborah sat in the defendant's box, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on her, but she kept her head held high, her gaze fixed on the judge's bench. Judge Margaret Hargrove entered the courtroom, her face a mask of cold indifference. She took her seat, her eyes scanning the room with a look of disdain. But as she began to speak, something unexpected happened. A man in a suit stood up from the back of the room and walked to the front. He introduced himself as Agent Daniel Harris of the FBI and handed Judge Hargrove a piece of paper. Her face turned pale as she read it, her hands trembling slightly. "Judge Hargrove," Agent Harris said, his voice firm and unwavering, "you are under arrest for corruption, abuse of power, and violation of civil rights." The courtroom erupted into chaos. Spectators gasped, reporters scrambled to capture the moment, and Judge Hargrove's face twisted in shock and anger. She tried to protest, but Agent Harris and his team quickly escorted her out of the courtroom, her once imposing figure now reduced to a shell of its former self. Deborah watched in stunned silence, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. It was a moment of vindication, of justice, but it was also a reminder of how broken the system was. Judge Hargrove's arrest was a victory, but it was also a call to action. a reminder that there was still so much work to be done. As the courtroom began to settle down, Emily approached the bench. She argued that with Judge Hargrove's arrest, Deborah's case should be dismissed, and the judge agreed. Just like that, Deborah was free. But as she walked out of the courtroom, her mind was already racing with thoughts of what came next. She had been given a second chance and she wasn't going to waste it. Deborah stepped out of the courthouse and into the sunlight, her eyes squinting against the brightness. The air was warm and the sounds of the city, cars honking, people talking, birds chirping, filled her ears. It was a stark contrast to the cold, sterile environment of the prison, and for a moment, Deborah just stood there taking it all in. She was free. But as she looked around, she realized that her journey was far from over. The fight for justice wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had ever been wronged by the system. And Deborah knew that she had a responsibility to use her newfound freedom to make a difference. Over the next few months, Deborah threw herself into activism. She spoke at rallies, her voice strong and unwavering as she shared her story with anyone who would listen. She worked with organizations that fought for criminal justice reform, using her experience to shed light on the systemic racism and corruption that had nearly destroyed her life. She became a symbol of hope, a living testament to the power of resilience and determination. People looked up to her not just for what she had endured, but for how she had risen above it. She was no longer just a victim. She was a warrior, a beacon of change in a world that often seemed resistant to it. But it wasn't easy. There were days when the weight of everything she had been through threatened to crush her. The memories of Officer Carl's cruel words, the humiliation of being treated like a criminal, the fear of losing everything, it all lingered like a shadow she couldn't shake. There were nights when she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with thoughts of what could have been, of what still needed to be done. The system was so deeply entrenched, so resistant to change. It felt like trying to move a mountain with her bare hands. But every time she felt like giving up, she thought of Maya, of the world she wanted her to grow up in, and she found the strength to keep going. One day, Deborah received a call from Emily, her former clerk. Emily's voice was filled with excitement as she delivered the news. Officer Carl had been found guilty on all counts and was facing a lengthy prison sentence. It was a moment of closure, of justice, but it was also a reminder of how much work still needed to be done. Deborah hung up the phone and looked out the window, her mind racing with thoughts of the future. She knew that the fight for justice was far from over, but she also knew that she was ready to face whatever came next. Deborah's nonprofit organization, Second Chances, was gaining traction. She and Elijah, the former inmate who had helped her uncover the corruption, worked tirelessly to help formerly incarcerated individuals reintegrate into society. They provided job training, legal assistance, and mentorship, helping people rebuild their lives after prison. The work was hard and progress was slow, but Deborah found a sense of purpose in it that she had never known before. She saw the impact they were making, the lives they were changing, and it gave her hope. Hope that the system could be fixed, that justice could be served, that people like her and Elijah could rise above their circumstances and make a difference. But even as she focused on the future, Deborah couldn't forget the past. The scars of her ordeal were still there, a constant reminder of how far she had come. And she knew that the fight was far from over. There were still officers like Carl, still systems rigged against people of color, still injustices that needed to be exposed. One evening, as Deborah sat on the porch of her small apartment, watching the sun set over the city, she felt a sense of peace. Maya was inside, drawing pictures at the kitchen table, her laughter drifting through the open window. The air was warm, the sky painted in shades of orange and pink, and for a moment, everything felt right. But Deborah knew that this peace was fragile, that it could be shattered at any moment. The fight for justice was never ending, a constant battle against forces that sought to divide and oppress. But she was ready. She had been through the fire, and she had emerged stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever. As she sat there, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Deborah made a silent promise to herself, to Maya, and to everyone who had ever been wronged by the system. She would keep fighting no matter how hard it got. She would use her voice, her story to bring about change. And she would never stop believing in the possibility of a better future. Because that was what justice was all about: hope, resilience, and the unwavering belief that, no matter how dark things seemed, the light would always find a way to break through. Months passed and Deborah's life began to settle into a new rhythm. The nonprofit she and Elijah had started, Second Chances, was gaining traction. They had helped dozens of formerly incarcerated individuals find jobs, secure housing, and rebuild their lives. The organization was becoming a beacon of hope in the community, a testament to the power of resilience and second chances. But even as Deborah poured her heart into the work, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was still something missing, some piece of the puzzle that hadn't yet fallen into place. One afternoon, as Deborah was sorting through old files in the small office they had rented for the nonprofit, she came across a letter that had been sent to her while she was in prison. It was from Elijah, the same letter that had mentioned the secret file and the corruption within the judicial system. Deborah had read it before, but this time something about it caught her attention, a detail she had overlooked. Elijah had mentioned a name, a man who had been at the center of the corruption network, Victor Grayson. Deborah's heart raced as she stared at the name. Victor Grayson wasn't just some low-level player. He was a powerful businessman with connections in politics, law enforcement, and the judiciary. If what Elijah had overheard was true, Grayson was the one pulling the strings, the one who had blackmailed Officer Carl and others into doing his bidding. He was the real mastermind behind the corruption that had nearly destroyed Deborah's life. Deborah immediately called Elijah, her hands trembling as she dialed the number. "Elijah, we need to talk. Now." When Elijah arrived at the office, Deborah showed him the letter and pointed out the name. Elijah's eyes widened as he read it. "I remember now," he said slowly. "The guards mentioned Grayson. They said he was the one calling the shots, the one who had Officer Carl in his pocket. But I didn't think much of it at the time. I was just trying to survive in there." Deborah leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. If Grayson was as powerful as Elijah said, taking him down wouldn't be easy. But Deborah knew they had to try. This wasn't just about her anymore, it was about everyone who had been wronged by the system, everyone who had been denied justice because of people like Grayson. Over the next few weeks, Deborah and Elijah began to dig deeper. They reached out to contacts in the legal and activist communities, piecing together what they could about Grayson's operations. What they uncovered was shocking. A vast network of corruption that extended far beyond what they had initially imagined. Grayson had his hands in everything from drug trafficking to money laundering to influencing judicial decisions. He was a shadowy figure, always one step ahead, always protected by his wealth and connections. But Deborah and Elijah were determined. They knew they couldn't take Grayson down alone, so they reached out to Agent Daniel Harris, the FBI officer who had arrested Judge Hargrove. At first, Harris was skeptical. Grayson was a powerful man and taking him on would be risky. But as Deborah and Elijah laid out the evidence they had gathered, Harris's skepticism turned to determination. "This is bigger than any of us," Harris said finally. "If what you're saying is true, Grayson is a threat to the entire system. We need to bring him down, but we have to do it carefully. One wrong move and he'll slip through our fingers." The investigation that followed was intense and nerve-wracking. Deborah, Elijah, and Harris worked tirelessly, gathering evidence, interviewing witnesses, and building a case against Grayson. It was dangerous work, and there were moments when Deborah wondered if they were in over their heads. But she refused to back down. She had come too far to let fear stop her now. Finally, after months of painstaking work, they had enough evidence to move forward. Harris secured a warrant for Grayson's arrest, and the operation was set into motion. The day of the arrest, Deborah and Elijah waited anxiously, their hearts pounding as they watched the news for updates. When the report finally came, it was everything they had hoped for. Grayson had been arrested at his mansion, his empire crumbling around him. The footage showed him being led away in handcuffs, his face pale and drawn, a far cry from the powerful figure he had once been. The news anchors detailed the charges against him: racketeering, bribery, conspiracy, and more. It was a victory, but it was also a reminder of how deep the roots of corruption ran. As Deborah watched the screen, a wave of emotions washed over her: relief, satisfaction, but also a sense of closure. Grayson's arrest wasn't just about bringing a criminal to justice. It was about reclaiming the power that had been taken from her, about proving that no one was above the law. But even as she savored the moment, Deborah knew that the fight wasn't over. Grayson's arrest was a significant victory, but it was just one battle in a much larger war. The system was still broken, still rigged against the marginalized and the vulnerable. And as long as that was the case, Deborah knew she couldn't stop fighting. She thought about Maya, about the world she wanted her to grow up in, a world where she wouldn't have to fight for the basic rights that so many took for granted. A world where justice wasn't just a privilege for the powerful but a right for everyone. That was the world she was going to fight for, no matter how long it took. As she sat there watching the news coverage of Grayson's arrest, Deborah felt a sense of peace. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but she was ready. She had been through the fire, and she had emerged stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever. And as she looked out at the city skyline, she knew that she wasn't alone. Together, with Elijah, Harris, and everyone who believed in justice, they would continue to fight for a better future.